Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in today's one we're taking a look at the Nvidia GTX 980 4GB. Now this launched back in 2014 and you would have expected to pay over £400, $500 for what was a high-end card at the time. In 2025, well, just a couple of weeks ago actually, I paid less than £50 after winning this EVGA SC version on eBay. I was the winning bidder luckily, and I'm pretty pleased with my purchase. This is a fine looking card. I certainly miss EVGA GPUs, but let's see how it performs these days. Now I've tried a couple of things here. I've tried to turn the settings up as high as I could in order to hit 30 FPS, and then I've made all the necessary sacrifices in order to hit at least 60 FPS, so you get an idea of how it performs when targeting to different frame rates. I've also messed around with upscaling in some scenarios as well, but for some of those online competitive FPS titles I've just tried to target 60 right away, as I feel like this is important in that genre of games. But we'll get into it and start with Black Myth Wukong, a pretty demanding title at 1080p with the low preset and TSR with 100% scale. Now this is actually going to get you plus 30 frames per second, 37 to be precise, with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 30, so it's pretty smooth going as far as the 4GB 980 is concerned. Now if you want to hit at least 60 frames per second, it is actually possible, but we will of course need some upscaling. TSR seems to look quite nice and gives us a decent performance boost, and to be honest, even with 50% resolution scale it doesn't look too blurry. You're going to see 68 frames per second when you apply these settings. In terms of the percentile lows we saw 57 and 18, so a few dips and drops here and there, but in terms of that average I think this is acceptable given the age of the card. This is still supported by the way. In fact, at the time of this video I'm using the latest driver 572.47. Now there are a few different options we can go with for Baldur's Gate 3. If we want plus 30 frames per second, then there is no issue with using the high preset and TAA. This will actually give us 46 and it will account for some inevitable dips and drops. That being said, the 1.1% lows were 39 and 35, so it was pretty smooth going overall. Now if we want to hit 60 frames per second, we can do so with the low preset. Again, I kept TAA enabled, and we saw 74 frames per second this time on average, with a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 33. Again, a few little drops here and there, but this is a 4GB card, and in my opinion it's certainly doing its best in 2025. It's working very hard with what it's got, and it seems to be doing a respectable job. There's also another way to hit plus 60 frames per second in Baldur's Gate 3. For example, if we want to keep a higher preset such as medium, we can apply FSR 2.2 quality for 71 frames per second overall. This gave us a 1% low of 54 and a 0.1% low of 50, so this was actually very smooth. Smoother in fact compared to the low preset with no upscaling applied, and it still looks good considering this is a newer version of FSR. I've specified the version of FSR used if the game has more than one option, otherwise I've just written FSR among the frame rate statistics. Now Counter-Strike 2, obviously as an online fast-paced game, you're going to want as high a frame rate as possible. I didn't go with the low preset, I thought we might as well go somewhere in between. 234 on average then at the medium preset with the default MSAA turned off. This will actually come on when you select the medium preset, as will FSR upscaling, but that was off as well. Now our average was decent and our percentile lows were also pretty solid, 155 and 105, so not much to speak of in the way of stutter here. This is certainly more demanding on the GPU than its predecessor CSGO, but it still runs well on a wide range of hardware including older cards like this, especially older high-end offerings. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a fantastic game which runs very nicely on the 980. Surprisingly so, I thought it would struggle a bit more. Maybe running very nicely is a bit of an overstatement, but the low preset with SMAA 2TX, the default native AA, gave us 42 frames per second, a 1% low of 32 and a 0.1% low of 28. So if you want to play at plus 30 frames per second on this card, you can do so by keeping things at low medium, and you're going to see a lot more frequent drops below 30 frames per second. You might see an average of just about 30 frames per second, but those dips and drops are going to make it feel a lot less playable in some of the more demanding areas such as forests and built up cities. At the low preset with FSR balanced, however, we just about scraped by with an average of 60 FPS. Now we can of course select FSR performance, but this does make certain text hard to read, and this is also stated in the menu as well. So the developers themselves have stated that if you select FSR performance, it's going to look pretty blurry in some instances. Balanced is a nice place to be, and while we won't see plus 60 FPS all of the time, we do average it with pretty decent percentile lows as well, 45 and 42. Spider-Man 2 next, and oh boy, this one does not run very well even on the best of my hardware, to be fair, certainly not without stutter. Here, with the low preset and TAA, because it sharpens up a few of those edges, we saw 37 frames per second, a 1% low of 13 and a 0.1% low of 12. So this definitely goes to show that there were a few performance problems, that's for sure. Switching to the very low preset doesn't really change the performance all that much, so I actually kept it going forward. I just enabled FSR Ultra Performance, which can look a bit of a blurry mess in some places, but it's what's necessary in order to try and hit 60 plus FPS. Now with the low preset and FSR Ultra Performance, then we saw 63 FPS on average, a 1% low of 29 and a 0.1% low of 26, so it's still not perfect, and that's certainly an understatement, but this will be the only way really in order to play Spider-Man 2 on PC on a 980 with plus 60 frames per second. I think perhaps targeting somewhere in between with a slightly less aggressive form of FSR is probably your best bet. Next up, I tested Red Dead Redemption, the original game first of all, because this is fantastic, one of my all-time favourites, 1080p at the Ultra preset and FSR with native AA for 88 frames per second. Of course, this is an older console game, came out about a decade and a half ago, but it only came to PC in 2024, and I think it's well worth a test and certainly well worth a play if you haven't done so already. Now we saw 88 FPS overall, so no real problems here, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 51. Even in and around towns with more going on, like Armadillo here, you're going to get really nice performance, and I think the game still holds up visually as well. We'll move on to Starfield next. I didn't have much hope for this one, certainly not for 60 frames per second. I thought it would be a struggle. I also thought 30 FPS would be a struggle, to be honest, but we'll start with targeting that, and in order to hit plus 30, we're going to need the lowest settings with FSR at 70% scale. We just about scraped by at 35, and I say scraped by because there were certainly some dips and drops below 30 FPS quite frequently, to be honest, but considering this is a decade-old card with 4GB of VRAM, I don't think it did too badly, especially when you consider that this is Starfield and it can put a lot of hardware through its paces, even newer and better GPUs. You can give up on trying to target 60 FPS, and that's all I can really say, because I set the game to 720p with the lowest setting still, and I then dropped the FSR to 50%, so 50% of 720p. 43 FPS. We didn't even see a 10 FPS improvement when dropping the resolution to 720p and completely decimating the visual quality. 43 certainly feels a lot better than 35, but at what cost? I mean, look at it. What a sight this is. The 1% low was 31 and the 0.1% low was 28. So again, smoother overall, but your eyeballs are going to start straining. Stalker 2 up next, 34 frames per second overall with TSR performance enabled and 25% scale. Now, I do appreciate that there are a lot of upscaling options implemented within this game, and to be honest, TSR doesn't look too bad, even when you drop it right down to 25% scale like I've done here. It does mean that we get a plus 30 FPS average, but you can forget totally about trying to target 60 FPS. It's just not going to happen. Our 1 and 0.1% lows here were 20 and 7, so not an ideal experience with a 4GB 980. I think this is certainly very VRAM limited, but I mean it still hit plus 30, and I wasn't expecting that to start with anyway, so there we are. For Flight Simulator 2024 then, I went with the low end preset and TAA, which gave us 32 frames per second. There will be some dips and drops, especially when we switch between the cockpit view and the view from the outside of the plane. I'm willing to let this go with this title because it's not exactly a fast paced game, and I don't think the frame drops really matter as much here. The 1% low was 20 FPS and the 0.1% low was 16 FPS. Now if we want 60 frames per second, we can actually average this by turning the remaining settings down to their lowest. Low end isn't going to set everything to its lowest, but if we go through the options manually and set everything to its respective lowest figure, and we enable FSR with performance, we can actually hit 60 FPS overall. Again, there will be some dips and drops below this, 43 for that 1% low and 27 as that 0.1% figure, but I don't think it's too bad considering that this game is pretty intensive. The 980 is holding up fairly well here. Of course, we've got the whole world to explore in this one, and some areas or countries will run better than others. I'm flying over London here, which is quite an intensive part of the world. So yeah, it's we're probably getting a little less on average than we would if we were flying over the ocean somewhere with not much going on. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 next, 1080p with a basic preset and FSR3 quality. Now we just about hit 60 frames per second with FSR or any other form of upscaling off, but just to be safe, I thought we'd enable FSR anyway, just to keep things a little more consistent. We actually saw 74 FPS on average by doing this, and our 1% low was also sitting at above 60, 63 FPS overall, with a 1% low of 58. So this certainly improved the consistency of the game, which is definitely what you want when you're playing online and you want as many frames as possible. I didn't want to sacrifice the visual quality too much, however, because it's still nice to see what's going on screen. We still need to be able to see the enemy players in order to wipe them out, of course. For Fortnite, 1080p medium preset. Again, I was thinking like this is an online title, so just like CS2, I didn't want to push the preset too hard. I just went with medium because it still looks pretty respectable, but it runs nicely as well. Using DX12 mode here for 109 FPS overall, a 1% low of 85 and a 0.1% low of 57. I found that DX11 mode can give you a higher average frame rate, but DX12 is a lot more consistent as of recent. I've been using DX12 pretty much all the time when I play this game, and I found that there are certainly a lot less frame dips and drops. Of course, it's worth trying both out for yourselves, but in my experience, DX12 has been the better choice, especially with, well, I was going to say newer cars, but this thing's 10 years old and it's still pretty smooth. For Cyberpunk 2077, we have the medium preset, textures and crowds for 39 frames per second. This is as high as I'd push this, to be honest. The 1% low was 33 and the 0.1% low was 30. Now if we want to target 60 frames per second, there are a couple of ways we can do this. We can leave the medium preset as it is with the textures and the crowds, but we can turn on FSR3 performance mode. This will give us 61 FPS, a 1% low of 42 and a 0.1% low of 40. Of course, there will be drops below 60 FPS in some areas, but we're going to hit 60 FPS as an average, and it feels a lot smoother to play while not actually looking all that bad. To be honest though, I think the better bet is by turning everything down to its respective lowest apart from crowds, just to make Night City feel a little more lively. I left crowds at medium, but this time instead of performance FSR3 mode, I went with quality. So the city still looks a little lively, but it also looks a lot sharper this time around, and our average frame rate was also higher, 64 frames per second, with improved percentile lows of 51 and 40. This is probably how I'd play Cyberpunk on a 980 if I was using it on a daily basis. We'll finalise then with Red Dead Redemption 2. 1080p first of all with the ultra textures, everything else at medium, as well as TAA set to medium. Now I try and keep textures at ultra every time I test this because there is a significantly noticeable difference between ultra and high. Ultra settings for the textures is basically the only good looking setting, in my opinion anyway, and overall we're going to see 56 FPS with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 30. Not quite 60 frames per second, but it certainly feels more than acceptable here. Now, in order to get plus 60 FPS guaranteed, you're going to want the ultra texture still, everything else set to medium, but this time FSR set to balanced. This will give us 71 FPS in return, a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 48. If we don't want any upscaling at all though, then we can actually remain with the ultra textures but set everything else to low instead of medium. We can keep the TAA at medium, turn the sharpness up a bit just to make things look a little better, and we're going to average 64 FPS by doing this. The 1% low was 54 and the 0.1% low was 40, so this is probably my preferred way to play here instead of enabling upscaling, but there we are. Let me know what you think. This has been the 980 in 2025. I think it's still holding up okay, not bad for less than 50 quid here in the UK, but the VRAM is certainly going to become more of a limitation as we move through 2025, and it's hard to say how much longer this will be supported driver-wise. If you bought this 10 years ago though, well, you've certainly got a good run from it. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know if you still use one of these, of course. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.